Wow, what a great crowd. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very excited to be hosting journalist David Sanger, who's here to discuss his new book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. Anyone who reads the New York Times, and especially its national security coverage, is no doubt familiar with David's byline. He's been with the Times pretty much since he got out of college 42 years ago, and has had quite a run. Tokyo bureau chief, Washington economic correspondent, White House correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and chief Washington correspondent. His current title is White House and National Security Correspondent. He's been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes. He's also the author of 3 previous very well-received books, The Perfect Weapon, which explored the growing threat and use of cyber warfare, Confront and Conceal, about President Obama's secret wars, and The Inheritance, about the foreign policy concerns that Obama inherited from Bush in 2009. In his spare time, David co-teaches a course on national security at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. New Cold Wars, in scope and complexity, is David's most sweeping work yet, and it's especially timely. The book looks at the reemergence in recent years of superpower conflict, which, as David reminds us, wasn't supposed to happen. At least it wasn't anticipated back when the Cold War ended. Then the notion of a peace dividend was fashionable, and conventional thinking envisioned an era of stability and prosperity during which a declining Russia and a rising China would integrate themselves into the West in their own ways. Everybody remember that? Well, now in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and America's deteriorating relations with China, it's clear the United States is facing conflict, not just with one, but 2 major adversaries, and compounding matters, those 2 have strengthened their own bonds with each other. How we got into this fraught new era, including the misjudgments and missteps by U.S. authorities, is what David's book is about. And as David cautions in the end, and I'm sure we'll elaborate on here in a minute, it would be wrong to regard the new tensions as a replay of old Cold War ones. The new era is likely to be far more challenging to manage. Now, David's exceptionally well positioned to be telling this story. He brings to the narrative not only his own broad and seasoned grasp of strategic affairs, but also a wealth of revealing and fascinating details drawn from his access to many key players and from having reported firsthand on many of the events described in the book. In conversation with David will be Michael Beschloss, one of the most prominent historians today, specializing in the U.S. presidency. Michael's the author of 10 books, all exhibiting his gift for both storytelling and insight. His most recent work, Presidents of War, examined how U.S. presidents, despite a constitution intended to make it difficult for them to lead America into combat, got embroiled in wars anyway. And he was just telling me he's doing his next book is going to be on race in the presidency. So keep an eye out for that one. Please join me in welcoming David Sanger and Michael Beschloss.
Do you want to talk first?
Well, only to say thank you all for coming on a gorgeous day when you could have thought about enjoying a spring day. We're delighted that you're coming out to share it with us. It's great to see so many old friends in the neighborhood here. And thank you to my friend Michael, a friend of 30 years now.
I hope he says that at the end of this event, too.
Yeah, well, I said at the beginning in case I reconsider.
Right.
Right. And I also want to point out somewhere here is my wife Cheryl, who many of you know. There she is. Wave your hand, Cheryl. Cheryl's the one who
Who not
keeps
only
all the-
comes to her husband's event, but stands, does
Yeah.
not sit. Very
Right.
impressive, Cheryl.
and our great book team who put this together. Mary Brooks, Mary Wave. Is Michelle here someplace? No, we don't have Michelle. Okay, so um, um, who else is here? There's Kevin. Wow. Kevin, raise your hand out here. Kevin was the editor of this book and the editor as well of The Perfect Weapon, for
Right.
those of you who were
You
fans
wouldn't have
of it.
believed how long they were before Kevin got to it.
Yeah, right, right.
Joke.
So, with all of that, I leave myself to Michael's tender mercies.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to thank you especially for doing this out of such charity for David, because the problem is that he's written really one of the great books of our time, and I really mean that. The problem is it's gotten no publicity.
Oh, okay.
No one has wanted to have him on TV, and it hasn't been mentioned on any show that I've seen or heard. And so the result is that, when did it come out? On Tuesday?
Tuesday, yeah.
So David has been at home waiting for the telephone to ring, and no one was, but he was looking forward to Saturday because he knew that at least some of his friends would come out and show him some support.
That's it.
So thank you all for being here and helping. Kidding aside, what I told David was exactly the opposite, which is that you were so overexposed, it's going to be hard for us to talk about anything that you've not already talked about to audiences of several million. If I may say a word about the book as we begin. I write history usually when it's out about people who are safely dead, although their families are not always that way, and they can complain about the book that you wrote about their relative in case the person you're writing about is no longer with us. But David writes books, as all of you know, that really read like history and have the texture of history. Because in my view, history is, if you have to take it down to two ingredients, it would be two things. Number one, people like me wait 40 years or more to get information that people did not have at the time about a president or about a foreign leader. And the other thing is that you wait 40 years or more because you have hindsight. But the thing that drives me crazy about David is that he doesn't have to wait the 40 years because he's got such amazing sources, some of them anonymous, some of them may even be present. Is anyone blindfolded or a cloak and dagger?
If
someone in a
anybody here,
mask.
if anybody here has actually talked to me, you can pretend we
Right, pretend that you don't know him.
Yeah.
But anyway, he always manages to make you feel as if a period that you have just lived through, which we have the last couple of decades with this book, as if you're reading a story that you did not know. And that's because of his unbelievably hard work and his huge talent at getting people to confide things that they will not confide to others. And the other thing is, David doesn't wait the 40 years for hindsight, but he's got such wisdom and judgment in real time. If you look at some of his books that were published years ago, even though they were written, almost immediately after the events he was writing about, the judgments really do tend to stand up. So on behalf of all historians, I'm here to complain about David infringing on our territory, since we in such a lordly say, what do you think of Donald Trump or Barack Obama? Well, you'll have to wait for 40 years. I have no opinion. So with that having been said, I thought I would try to talk about the book as history, and I think it stands up, as I say, very well to that standard. I'm not going to do this like Brian Lamb. There's this person, Cheryl Sanger, on the acknowledgments page. Who is she?
Beautiful lady right
yes,
over there.
indeed.
Yeah, right.
So I'll do it this way. To sort of approach the history that goes at the beginning of what you're writing about, essentially David is telling us that we are in a crisis, a world crisis that we should be alarmed about, that could have grave results for us and for our children and our friends. So if you're someone from another planet dropped into the United States and looking at our relationships with other countries and the dangers we face in 2024, what kind of things should we worry about?
Well, thanks, Michael. This is really a book about the kind of judgments we made after the Cold War ended, the kind of failed assumptions we made about how the world would play out, a common understanding at the time that we were at the end of history, that Russia and China, each for their own reasons, would find it necessary to go just sign up to the Western rules that had been created by the United States, by the European Union, by NATO, and so forth, and that it was going to be in their economic interest to just keep oil flowing for the Russians, to keep industry growing and jobs being created for the Chinese, and so they would not challenge the system. When we look back at that today, it seems a little bit crazy and a little bit naive. I argue in the book it was an experiment we had to try, but we ignored the evidence that it wasn't working out. And then what the book tries to do is take you into the Biden administration and ask the question, given the assumptions we made then, what can we see coming in the next 30 or 40 years? A very hard thing to go predict, but the key element to it being that after spending 20 years with the United States focused on counterterrorism, the government of 5 administrations really focused on organizing itself toward that end. We're now trying to shift the gears to deal with a new era of superpower confrontation that we're trying to keep from turning into conflict. And it's a lot harder because, as Brad said as he was introducing this, the old Cold War and the new bear a few similarities, and certainly there is a containment of power effort underway with both Russia and China, even though no administration wants to go use that phrase for obvious reasons. They also don't like using the phrase Cold War. But what we are seeing is that this new era is a lot more complicated, a lot more dangerous, in part because there are simply more players. You know, the old Cold War, Michael, which you wrote so much about, and I was trying to think of your 10 books, probably 4 or 5 of them were Cold War, centered. Yeah, right. I've read each one of them, so there you go. And
I wish you were representative of the world audience.
I'm sure it's true of everyone in this room. Anyway,
we'll be giving quizzes on the way out.
Yes, but in that period of time, it was primarily a 2-country contest, and it was primarily a military contest. And within that, it was primarily a nuclear competition, right? And we knew we could count their nukes and they could count ours. And you could pick up the phone and know who you were going to talk to at the other end. And we knew who had launch authority. And so there was something of a predictability to it, even while it was terrifying. And we had terrifying moments, the Cuban Missile Crisis, other times that we were deeply fearful. But there was a certain reassuring pattern to it over time. This is completely different. You've got 2 different countries. They are combining their powers at various moments. There's no phone to pick up. And because, particularly with China, it is a military, it is an economic, it is a financial, it is a technological competition, it has so many more layers and so many more points of miscalculation.
Okay. And let's begin with the worst and then work up to hope. What is the worst result that we as citizens and maybe that an American president can expect if, let's say, our relations with China and Russia do not go well in the next couple of years?
Well, the first and most important task for any government is to keep its citizens safe. And that means starting with making sure that nuclear weapons are in full control. And that's been one of the most worrisome elements of this period of time, particularly as Russia has threatened to use tactical weapons in Ukraine. There's a scene in the book from October of 2022 when President Biden went up to New York to go to a fundraiser at James Murdoch's house. He's sort of the black sheep of the Murdoch family. He's the big Democratic donor of the family. And so, you know, it was a usual group of New Yorkers standing around Murdoch's art collection, waiting to be able to go out to the Hamptons that next weekend and say, well, the president said to me over cocktails, you know, so forth and so on. Biden comes in and he basically says, we are right now facing something that is the closest to nuclear exchange we have come since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he was saying we're facing a situation in which there is a high possibility of nuclear use. He didn't say it, but he had been told that possibility was 50-50 that weekend. And it was 50-50 because they had picked up intercepts of Russian generals who were responsible for moving nuclear weapons. And they believed that this was a point in time when the war was going very poorly for the Russians. They believed that they may well be preparing to detonate a nuclear weapon. And what Biden said was, once you start down that road, even if it was with small nuclear weapons, there's no getting off that road. And we are on our way to Armageddon, which led his staff to call this somewhat bitterly the next morning the Armageddon speech. And he had just had a very similar conversation with them in the Oval Office, which tells you should always listen to what he has to say during fundraisers, I guess. Yeah.
It's probably not a bad rule for any political
Right.
leader. And
So that's at the worst end. But there are many shades short of that, Michael. And obviously, in the technological realm, what we are most worried about, and we'll get to this a little bit later on, is losing permanently the edge that we have had in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, all of the key technologies that we're worried about for commercial purposes, but also for military purposes. And that's why Ukraine has been so fascinating for many in the United States. It's been a huge human toll, as I can tell, but it has also been very much an area of experiment for the U.S. because for the first time they have been able to test out in real battle against a real force how the technological changes they have brought about to the U.S. military have fared, and that story we tell as well.
sure. Before we go backwards in time, do you have an idea in your mind what the Chinese really want from us in 10 years? Do they want to dominate the world? Do they want us to be in an outwardly cordial relationship in which they have the upper hand? You know, just this is instinct. What
Right.
is your instinct?
Yes, on the outwardly cordial relationship, they don't want to get into a conflict any more than we do, and I think they fear very much what that would look like. But they've been very explicit. The Made in China 2025 program, which started in 2015, was an effort to make sure that they were the dominant force in a series of key technologies from semiconductors to quantum computing to AI to battery production to biological materials by next year. They're going to make it in some, they're not going to make it in others. And they're not going to make it in semiconductors, I would argue, in part because of mistakes they made, but in part because the U.S. has in recent years made this more difficult. By 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the creation of the People's Republic, they have said explicitly they want to be the world's dominant military, political, economic, and technological force. And they want us pushed out to the second island chain. They want a sphere of influence that is quite similar to what they believe the United States had at the end of the 1900s. And most of all, they want Taiwan.
And how do you think they're doing in their advance toward that?
Not as well as I would have said 2 or 3 years ago when we started this book. The economic slowdown in China has exposed all kinds of divisions within the country. We have to remember that they too are not 10 feet tall. And I think it has slowed their timeline for Taiwan. It has certainly slowed their timeline for semiconductor independence. They've been pretty clear. They not only want independence in the production of the technologies I described, but they want the rest of the world dependent on them. And, this sounds aggressive, but it's not all that different from the way we viewed the world in the 1950s or 1960s.
Sure. So, remember I said that the two strengths of this book are, number one, you're going to read all sorts of things that you had no idea happened because they were secret until David came across them. And number two, he's constantly telling you where presidents made mistakes and where they did the right thing, given 2020 hindsight of what we now know has happened to the world. So I thought we'd just sort of walk through a few of these presidents, and if you could just sort of comment on each of them, and then I think we'll spend a little bit more time on Trump and Biden for obvious reasons.
If you need any help on the order of the presidents, just let me know.
Right,
Okay.
thank you,
Yeah,
Rob.
okay.
Yes. Anyone know who Millard Fillmore's Postmaster General was? Clinton. What happened in the 90s in terms of Russia and China, and how did he do, and what did he do wrong? What could he have done better?
So Clinton came into this. I remember I was still, Cheryl and I were still living in Tokyo. I was a Tokyo bureau chief for the Times when Clinton had one of his most important meetings with Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was drunk, but that was most days.
That's not exactly singling this out.
Yeah, right. And they were I remember watching them in the yard, the beautiful garden of the American embassy in Tokyo. And that was where they were trying to lay out the plan for steady democratization and then over time entry for Russia maybe into the European Union, but it was going to require a lot of reforms. It was going to require a lot of end of corruption and so forth. Many of you remember this era. Some of you were in government during this time when this was going on. He had a great faith that the internet was going to set free the people of China. And I remember going to Beijing University with him on a trip he took toward the end of his presidency, where he gave this great, inspiring, I believed it speech in which he said, the internet will undercut the authority of the Communist Party. And it will, as you communicate with everybody around the world, as they can't control it, I think he kept using the phrase, that would be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. It will erode their authority. Well, we now know that they're quite good at nailing Jell-O to the wall. And
not only Jell-O, unfortunately.
yeah, that's true. And they have used the same digital technologies that amazed us for the most exquisite social control. Now, this was before we could imagine facial recognition and many of the other techniques they've used. And the internet turned out to be a fabulous way to hunt down and find dissidents along the way. And that has been, the internal struggle. The authority of the Communist Party was not undermined by that in any way. When you move on to Bush, W, yeah. Here, his biggest focus after 9/11 was bringing Russia and China into the counterterrorism programs. And he thought it was absolutely essential that we do so. And in doing so, every time they cooperated, he would say, great, this shows that we have a common interest here. In fact, as Mary has pointed out a few times to us, he used the phrase New Cold War to describe counterterrorism operations. Didn't quite fit with that. But my most enduring memory of the moment here, and you'll read it in the first full chapter of the book, was floating down the Neva River one night. I was in the pool boat. Putin and his then wife, Bush and Laura Bush, were in this beautiful yacht, and they're going down. It's late May or June, so the sun is up until 10, 11 o'clock at night, and you can hear the sounds of music coming from it. And they're having this beautiful meal. that is being served by this sort of hulking guy standing in the background, who, of course, I later learn when we go back and find the photos, is Prigozhin. Before, when he was still Putin's chef, before he was inventing the Internet Research Agency to try to fix the 2016 election, before he invented the Wagner Group to be the mercenary force that was going to save the Russian military. There he was serving dinner. And we went back and tried to reconstruct the conversation that took place there. Condi Rice had taken very good notes along the way because she was translating some others that were on the boat. And, they were talking about joining the EU and maybe one day having Russia join NATO, right? The institution that was designed initially to contain the Soviet Union and the one that has been funding and arming the war on the Ukrainian side for the past 2.5 years.
Do you think it's a fair criticism that Bush was wrong when he said that he had looked into Putin's eyes and seen into his soul?
He saw something. I'm not sure it was his soul.
That's what's called a straight line.
Yeah. So, look, we had every reason to want to make this work. And we had every reason to believe, Michael, that over time, when faced with the choice between keeping revenue going and territorial ambition, sure, they'd pick the money. But to some degree, that was transferring our values on them. And so there were moments when we weren't listening. In 2007, Putin showed up at the Munich Security Conference, and he basically said, there are parts of our land that belong to the Russia of Peter the Great, whose bust he keeps in his office, right? And they are going to need to get somehow restored. And Bob Gates, then the defense secretary, he had carried over, of course, he was defense secretary under Bush and carried over then to Obama, stood up and said, I've been through one Cold War, it was plenty. 7 years later, Putin took Crimea. It took a year for the United States and its allies to put together any effective sanctions. And the next year, Michael, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, signs the Nord Stream 2 agreement to create a new pipeline to send gas around Ukraine so it would get none of the revenue and directly into Europe, and declared that Putin, while he may have had some nasty business he was doing down in Crimea, was essentially a reliable supplier.
Okay, if I can push you a little bit. In 1991, there were some people who said that everyone should not be joyous about the fact that Gorbachev had resigned in favor of Yeltsin. That was ignoring 900 years of Russian history, which liked empires and autocracy and very rough methods to keep people in line, and that sooner or later would come a leader or a demagogue. Zhirinovsky was the one who was mentioned in the early 90s, but who would respond to that and basically no matter how fine the leader you got, that person was going to be defeated by 900 years of Russian history. Did Clinton and George W. Bush take that seriously enough?
Clearly not. And of course, you were getting at this time the warnings about the expansion of NATO. And, the most searing critique of this came from George Kennan, whose books I'm sure are around here someplace, Brad. And, he made the argument, essentially a parallel argument to this, that expanding NATO was going to set them off. Now, my own view is if you have just released countries from the yoke of the Soviet Union, it's then got to be up to them. And if you set a set of standards and they met the standards, as Poland did, and then a series of other nations did, and most recently, of course, Finland and Sweden, it's hard to make the argument, no, you can't do this. And of course, that's what we're doing exactly right now with Ukraine, because nobody wants Ukraine to, President Biden and the Germans do not want Ukraine to enter NATO while a war is underway. Many of the Eastern European countries think they could live with it.
Yeah, I think they could. Okay, Barack Obama.
So Obama was a really interesting case. He had a very clear view of who Putin was. But at the same time, he, I think, did not want to go confront them on Crimea. He made the case to his own staff, look, we're not going to go to war over a Russian-speaking piece of territory that actually belonged to the Russians until the 1950s, meaning Crimea. And that was understandable to me because I think he would have had a very difficult time making the argument for doing that full on. The hard part for me to understand, and this came through for those of you who've read The Perfect Weapon or seen the HBO doc we made out of it, came from his refusal to acknowledge that it was Russia that was doing the cyber attacks on the State Department, the White House, the Pentagon, to sort of push back hard.
And you feel he should have. You write in the book.
They needed to name them. And what's interesting is the Biden administration is, no shock to you, filled with many of the same people who were in the Obama administration, and they are now naming not only the Russians, but the Chinese, and they have completely flipped 180 degrees here on what you need to do. In fact, some of the biggest concerns they have is that, particularly in China's case, they are not pushing back hard enough on an operation called Volt Typhoon, which has been to put code into water systems, Chinese code into water systems, utilities that could slow the American response to Taiwan or be used to create chaos here if there was a Taiwan incident.
So would you go with the critics who would say that by not defending Crimea, Barack Obama was, I'm not suggesting this, I'm quoting others, was tacitly encouraging Putin to someday have a war against Ukraine of the kind that we've seen?
I would say in the interviews we did for this book, when you went back and you asked people, okay, if you got to replay this one again, it was Crimea that came up most often. Not that they would have gone to war, but that there would have been heavy-duty sanctions right away and that they would have done the defensive arms for Ukraine, which Obama failed to do, even the lightest armed stuff. Trump later reversed that, but then, of course, held everything up. And you all heard the tapes. It's what led to the first impeachment, because if he was going to provide aid, at least he wanted some good dirt on Joe Biden. Yeah,
it was a perfect call.
Yeah.
All right, so now we come up to Donald Trump, Russia and China, what was going on and what finally happened.
Let's back up on Obama for a bit. Sure. On the China side. Sure. It was during the Obama administration that it was clear that Xi Jinping was going to become the next leader of China. And the intelligence reports that were circulating in the White House at that time were very clear. This was a guy who had come up through the system, and they were quite confident would not challenge U.S. primacy, would focus on the economy at home, on keeping employment full, wasn't going to build up his nuclear weapons.
Had good relationships with Americans earlier in his career.
Right. Sent his daughter to Harvard, as did many of the leadership who had sent their kids to schools across America. Seemed to enjoy himself when he came to the United States. And Biden was put in charge of being Xi Jinping's counterpart. So they traveled together. You've heard Biden say he traveled more with Xi Jinping than any other foreign leader has. And they went to Iowa to revisit a town and a house that Xi had stayed in years before when he was coming up through the Chinese system. Biden went to China, spent time touring around with Xi at that time. It turns out that the Xi Jinping they saw then was not the Xi Jinping they got when he took office. And we now know from secret speeches that Xi gave weeks after or months after he took office, which you'll read about in the book, that he almost immediately ordered the buildup of the Chinese nuclear program so that it would be on a path to getting to the size of the Russian and the American programs. You'll read that along the way, he began planning the crackdown on Hong Kong, and that was clearly an indication of where he planned to go on Taiwan. And then you'll read and hear how he took advantage of the Nancy Pelosi trip to Taiwan and used it to move Chinese forces so that they were regularly flying around, not just the closest coast of Taiwan to China, but the far coast, and they have never gone back. So there's been a plan unfolding here, and I would say we got Xi Jinping wrong in Obama and in Trump. And Trump, of course, for the first 3 years was like, I'll excuse anything as long as we get our trade deal.
And what was going on? Do you take that at face value, or was there something else going on here?
So there was a lot of tension inside the administration, the Trump administration, between some pretty China-savvy insiders led by Matt Pottinger, who was a deputy national security advisor, a Mandarin speaker, who was suddenly reading those secret speeches. He discovers them years later, after she has given them. And you'll read his account of that. And his staff began to really try to reorient the United States toward this era of superpower conflict. H.R. McMaster wrote a new national security strategy that basically said the era of counterterrorism is no longer the primary purpose of our national security structure. It is looking at these two revisionist and revanchist powers, as it referred to them. Then they sent Trump out to the Rose Garden to announce the strategy, and he gave a brilliant speech about counterterrorism. Okay, so he hadn't read his own
You're
content.
kidding.
Yeah, it's astounding, isn't it? Yeah, I know you're shocked.
Glad I'm sitting down.
Yeah, but the impetus within the administration was, further down, was all in the right direction. Trump did not turn against China until COVID came along, and he needed somebody to blame, and that's when the China
And he was
virus.
fairly kindly toward the Chinese at the beginning of the pandemic, too.
He was, and in
As you
fact,
say.
at one point, chewed out his Secretary of State for being too tough on the Chinese when he was still trying to get a trade deal.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to Trump and Russia. What is your theory of what was going on there?
This is like the great, mystery of all time. So obviously, Trump.
The answer is revealed in this book as
Right.
nowhere else.
It's on.
Everyone line up right now.
Yeah, it's on page 433. Right. Yeah. So obviously he's got an admiration for authoritarians because they don't have to put up with pesky things like prosecutors and Congress, right?
How about elections?
Elections too, which are annoying along the way. Putin does run elections. I think they're probably the kind that Trump could learn how to live with over time. So that's number one. Number two, the second theory is he was looking for real estate deals or business to do after he was out of office. That's entirely possible. Of course, that was...
Just sort of reminds you of Eisenhower, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot like that. But I think the third thing that we sort of have to remember along the way is that if you are so focused on the immediate deal that you think is going to benefit you and maybe your political fortunes for a while, whether it's a trade deal or anything else, you are, one, happier to go deal with authoritarians because they can push through the deal. And second, you're happy to sort of just give lip service to any other set of values, whether it is human rights or non-proliferation or whatever it might be. So there was nothing surprising in the conversations that he was having with Putin, the only thing that was surprising to me was that he was so open about it. And Michael, you'll remember this, but the first time that he met Putin when he was in office was in Hamburg at I think it was a G7 meeting. And he meets him 3 times. He tells the translator to destroy your notes. He wouldn't let anybody else listen to the conversation. And so the conference ends, and I go back to my hotel to go check out of the hotel. And Trump goes out to Air Force One. He's sitting there waiting to take off. And my cell phone rings. And it's Trump. And he says, David, I just had the most remarkable conversation with Putin. He told me that if it had been Russian code that was involved in the 2016 election, we never would have seen it because they are so good that we never would have gotten to it. Don't you think that's right? And every alarm bell in my head was going off because I'm thinking, if I say anything that is, at all confirming in his mind, he's going to go out and say, oh, the New York Times' cyber guy just said, yeah, the Russians are that good. So I said, that would contradict every one of the intelligence agency briefings that you got, Mr. President, as you were coming into office. And he said, oh, those were given to me by, Brennan and
Obama people.
And they were all political hacks and came from the FBI director. I fired him. I said, yes, sir, I read about that. So he was intent early on in just trying to destroy the concept that the Russians were responsible for this. And at the end of his presidency, while he was trying to cling on in the last few weeks, they came to him with evidence that it was the Russians behind the SolarWinds hack, which was the hack into software that is used by many government agencies and companies. And his immediate reaction was, how do you know this is Russia? I bet it was the Chinese.
Okay. We're going to go for about 5 more minutes ourselves and then come to you for questions. And I think there's one microphone. I know no one has been to one of these events here before, so you would have no idea how to do this. But in any case, think of great questions for about 5 minutes from now. And so let's close with Joe Biden. What should we think about Joe Biden and Russia and China?
So first, when Biden came in, he was determined to get out of Afghanistan. It was the one thing that he and Trump had actually agreed on in the campaign. And set his way on, and I would say probably the most the account in the book that probably makes the Biden team here most uncomfortable is my account of Afghanistan. I don't think it's actually any more critical than anything that's come out of their own government and inspector generals. But it's not that the concept was wrong; it's that the execution obviously was so poor, and that they had not gotten many of those people who had supported the U.S. out in advance. But I would argue that messing that up actually was a crystallizing moment for their staff and the White House staff and others, the way the Bay of Pigs was for the Kennedy presidency, and had the same effect. It made them sort of rethink their relationships and their assumptions. And I think it explains why they did the run-up to the Ukraine war so skillfully. Collecting and leaking the intelligence. You'll hear the story in the book of Bill Burns, who went on the record with me about his conversations back and forth with Putin. He was sent out to see Putin. Of course, by the time he got to Moscow, Putin wasn't there. He was in Sochi, but they talked anyway via video. What he came back and reported to the president, their decision to take this most secret information and over the objections of many in the intelligence community to release them to the public. You'll read about, and yet our European allies still, they agreed on what they were seeing, but they didn't agree with the American interpretation. And the weekend before the invasion happened, we're all back in Munich, where Putin had done that early speech. This is 2021. Or February of 2022. And the European leaders are all saying to me, he's bluffing. And the Americans are all saying, no, he's really going to go. And I remember having breakfast that Saturday morning before the invasion with Tony Blinken, and we're comparing notes of leaders who said to us from Europe, this is not going to happen. And Blinken said, David, I can't tell you whether this is 2 days, 4 days, 6 days, it's going to happen. It was 4 days, as it turned out. That was a real turning point. And I think that he gets very high marks for organizing a reaction that Putin did not anticipate. And Putin obviously made a lot of mistakes going in. But we're at a real turning point now, Michael, because while the funding just went through an hour before we all gathered here.
David staged that to have a suspenseful moment for this.
Actually, Brad called me and asked to arrange the timing.
They did together.
Yeah. But there are a couple questions. First of all, is it too late? Second, so much of this money is going to resupply stocks that we burned down in the United States, so a lot of it won't actually go to the Ukrainians. But thirdly, I think that the whole prolonged debate has made the world wonder here, are we in this for the long term? I mean, obviously, if Trump is elected, he's been clear he'll solve the problem in 24 hours. I can't think of a way you do that other than going to the Russians and giving them a fair bit of the territory.
So is that what you're predicting?
I think he's been pretty clear. He would sit down and work out the map, right? But I think the longer term question is, do we have the staying power? And that question goes way beyond Ukraine, because no one is watching this, Michael, more carefully than Xi himself. We are in a world, as I alluded to before, to when the Russians and the Chinese are in this uneasy partnership. It is exactly what Nixon and Kissinger were trying to avoid when they did the opening to China. I talked to Kissinger a little bit about this when I was interviewing him for his.
And I noticed he was very self-critical about what he had done earlier in his
Yes,
career.
right, in his usual way. But he was clearly worried that that was coming undone. And obviously he was invested, and many would say over-invested in the China relationship. But I think the big question that we have to think about for the future is, have we really settled in as a government on the thought that this new era of superpower confrontation, with all of the differences in the way we have to treat Russia and China and all of the other players, Iran, obviously, as you've seen in the past week, but also those who say, and said to me and Mary during our travels, don't make us choose between the US and China. We have to think about how we're going to go manage that. And frankly, right now, the Biden administration policy is, you're going to have to choose.
Interesting. Are we allowed to clap before the questions? I think Sir, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for coming. I have 1 point and 2 related questions that'll fit together very easily. One, without going into my background or agency, I strongly disagree with you that there are no political motivations in the intelligence industry or in what we call political generals. I'll leave it at that. There are a lot of people who are well known within the community that push an issue right and left. The question is relating to China and Russia's militarily coming together. You're probably familiar, and I'm going to butcher the name, the Swalwell Gap, which would connect Kaliningrad with Russia. Mm-hmm. Do you think the Russians through Belarus will come in and take that slice of territory in Lithuania? And dovetailing into that, it's not really covered by most of the media, especially the New York Times, unfortunately, is the issue with the tens of thousands of Chinese that are coming across the border. And from personal experience and watching body language and intelligence work, you can tell when these groups have come in, they're roughly about platoon-sized, and when you drop your mic cover, and when they get on the bus, for example, when they move, they're all single males, and they move as though they have had military training. When they see Border Patrol guy says, okay, everybody get on the bus, they all in unison pick up their stuff, their steps are all matched evenly, etc. And I was just curious as to what you think is going to happen with those folks that are now spread throughout the country. Thank you.
No, great questions. So first of all, lots of people in the yeah. A lot of people in the intelligence community, in the military, obviously have their own agendas, and that's hardly new in American politics. It was, true from the Revolutionary War on. So I wouldn't disagree with you there. On your central question, which is, would Lithuania or any of those others be next? So let's imagine a world for a moment where Putin has a partial victory in Ukraine, right? He's able to hold on to the South, the Donbass, Crimea, and so forth. I don't think he's got the power to take Kyiv again in a big hurry, but let's imagine that he is able to hold on to that. After resetting his military and reconsidering the many mistakes he made along the way, I think it's entirely possible that he would test our willingness to defend a smaller NATO country, particularly if he could find one that contributed, just to pull a number out of the hat, say less than 2% of their GDP to the military. And I think a lot of this depends on who gets elected. And I think the president is President Putin is being pretty clear. He wants to wait and see if Trump gets elected or not. It's a very different approach he's going to have to take depending on the outcome of the election. Do I think that testing is going to happen right away? No. Do I think there's a reason that he put his nuclear weapons back in Belarus? You bet.
If I could say one thing. We've got about 10 or 12 minutes left, so if we could make the questions sort of little and the answers, just so we can get as many people as brief as possible.
I got the hand.
Without restraining anyone, including the author.
A different question about China. Why in the United States do we not hear more about 2047, which is the time that Hong Kong reverts in its entirety to China? I had never heard of 2047 until I went on a tour of China where it was an open secret that 2047 would start happening before 2047, which it already has.
Yeah.
But
I think the short answer to your question is it's on such an accelerated schedule now that by 2047 you'll probably barely remember that was a date in the British agreement with China.
Great, thank you. Al Kilborn, who taught both of my children at Murray School, and if we do not give him enough time, he can go back and revise their grades downwards. So
no chance.
He would never do it.
But my God, quick question: If okay, yes, right. If Henry Wallace's advice had been taken, could the Cold War have been avoided?
The first one. Better question from Michael than from me.
If Henry Wallace's advice had been taken, could we have avoided the Cold War?
The initial one.
No,
yeah. Uh-huh.
Although I know a lot of his relatives, and 100% of them think that his advice should have been taken. Thank you, Al. Wonderful to see you.
So I was born in the 1940s. My father fought in the Battle of the Bulge. You talked to lots of people in the White House. Are they aware of World War II and how it got started? That's a serious question because it seems to me in the general population, the answer is no.
You know, a lot of the book deals with Biden's own caution because his critics would argue his overcaution. Because when the Ukraine war started, he gave two instructions to his staff. One was don't let the Russians win, and the second was don't start World War III. Okay, and these two have been constantly in tension ever since. In every arms debate, do we send them F-16s? Do we send them tanks? Do we send them HIMARS missiles and so forth? And there's a chapter called Boiling the Frog, as they realize that Putin is less sensitive to what we're sending than they initially thought. And that's why they have now pretty well expended the list. Now, there are people who argue that those arms should have been given earlier to Ukraine. I'm not sure, based on the reporting we did, that the Ukrainians could have taken them all in at that time.
Thanks.
Michael, you talked about 900 years of Russian history that Clinton was fighting, but isn't the issue a lot larger than that? I mean, right now, democracies are a small percentage of the number of nations that we have and the population, and that has been true for the entire arc of humankind. We're an anomaly. How do we deal with that going forward? How do we protect that? Because it seems as if by trying to expand it, we're grafting foreign tissue on a body politic that rejects it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'm glad Al Kilborn is here because he's a walking demonstration of what I'm about to say. And that is, it would be a good idea if our children were taught history and civics and what democracy really is. One of the most distressing things is if you look at poll surveys of young people, just they don't have the kind of background that people did in earlier generations. A lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that in recent decades, not everywhere, fortunately, but in a lot of public schools particularly, there's not the emphasis on civics and history and social studies that there used to be. And I think that has consequences. I'm trying to keep this brief.
The only thing I would add to that is a lot in the book about Biden in his first year or two constantly talking about the struggle between autocracy and democracy, and then what happens as this gets more complicated for him. For example, when he's got to show up in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and what does it mean historically if we look back, and was it a good thing that we had a president who was born in the early 1940s and who didn't remember World War II, but he certainly remembered hearing about it from his family and his friends, and that was the formative experience. Was that different from a president who was born much later, better or worse?
Yep.
Yeah, I just kind of had a question for both of you, just about like the current isolationist wave in the Republican Party, and like kind of what are the consequences for if America does become more isolationist in this period of time, and like what are the consequences for America, but also the consequences for the world?
This is one of those waves we've seen in American history throughout the 1800s, the 1900s. Tons of books have been written on the question of why this keeps coming back in the American psyche, the degree to which the fact that we're protected by two oceans, people seem to think, makes a difference in the modern world, and that's why the new technologies tell you it doesn't make a difference as much. But I thought it was interesting that when push came to shove this afternoon and you finally had to have a vote on a bill that provided $95 billion for Ukraine and also put money into aid to the Israelis, humanitarian aid to Gaza, money for Taiwan, that the votes were pretty overwhelming, which told you that there is a minority wing that held this thing up for the longest time. But it turned out, just as everybody said, that if you actually got it to a vote, it was relatively overwhelming for the U.S. to restore its traditional role. The problem is we lose so much time and so much international confidence as we tear ourselves apart on the way to getting to the relatively obvious answer that we do a lot of damage.
Great. I agree with David. Thank you.
Hi, David. It's really nice to see you here. I actually work in the Chinese embassy, and which is very close to this bookstore. I often come here because I know it was founded by the chief speechwriter of the Obama administration. There are several points that I have to say I don't really disagree with you. First of all, I think when it comes to the centenary goal of China, to my knowledge, our goal is really to become a better self, and we don't have the intention to in your word, to dominate the world. And as we have often say, we don't bet America to lose. And also in terms of the nuclear power, I think in comparison with that of the United States and Russia, China is still far, far, far below these two big countries. And even in terms of military expenditure, in terms of the share of the GDP, China's military expenditure is still far below that of many other major countries. My question is, actually, as you mentioned, Kissinger, whether Kissinger regretted having opened the China-U.S. relationship. But the thing is, at that time, we have that big triangle theory, and it wasn't China who begged the United States to open the door to China. And to my own understanding, because of the misperception of the United States about China, somehow that has pushed China closer to Russia, and pushed our two countries becoming further and further from each other. And so the question are two. The first one is, there are several areas where our two countries can work together. For example, in terms of artificial intelligence, climate change. When our two countries work together, that will be very helpful for the humanity to meet the challenges. So in which way do you think journalists and American media can help promote the better stories about China and the United States?
Well, we cover it pretty extensively across the way in both the competition and the cooperation. You're absolutely right. Obama signed a climate agreement with Xi Jinping. And the most interesting, quiet conversation underway now between China and the United States is a quiet dialogue on regulating artificial intelligence. Now, in the U.S. view, this would ultimately morph into some kind of arms control conversation, because none of us want our most advanced weapons to be guided by AI. But that is one of the shoots. And I think in the past 6 or 7 months since the meeting between the president and Xi Jinping at Riverside, there has been an improvement in the relationship. But almost everybody in the U.S. side who's involved in it believes this is a little bit of a temporary lull that comes out of the economic strain that China finds itself in today. And the trick is, can you extend it even when the Chinese economy comes back, which it certainly will.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions, and those who were not able to ask, I will personally make sure he doesn't leave until you've asked him what you had in mind. Yes, sir.
Full disclosure, I'm a former CIA analyst on nuclear proliferation. And of course, I think many people at the agency would always read very closely your articles on those issues. And I'm a Kissinger biographer. But in any case, what I'm interested in both of your reactions to are that Kissinger, about a year ago, and Joseph Nye, the Harvard professor, were in agreement, almost verbatim, that China's ability to become a genuine superpower is going to be constrained by geography and topography. They're surrounded on the eastern edge of the Eurasian landmass by so many countries. 3 are nuclear weapon states, if we assume the North Koreans.
Seems a reasonable assumption after 6 nuclear tests.
What's that?
Seems a reasonable assumption after 6 nuclear tests. Yeah, the North Koreans, right.
Nye did not make the point that they don't have soft power like America. Chinese culture is not exportable. But the only other thing I would add is a fellow wrote a letter to the Washington Post recently. He said, if China invades Taiwan, they'll never feed their population. They have 18% of the world's population, only 9% of the world's arable land, and only 6% of the fresh water. So the question is, do you buy into this notion that China is somewhat overrated in a sense about what its grandiose visions of where it can end up?
So I think we certainly overemphasize the Chinese threat, and that is a big fear. And we did this in the 50s, and I think we're doing it today. To your point, the Chinese soft power and culture can't be exported, I would suggest that before Congress bans it, you download TikTok on your phone, because it has been the most successful cultural export from a Chinese company that we have ever seen. Right?
No, I didn't say anything about that.
Right. And if you can't download it on your phone, there are people in the back of the room here who will be happy to help you with that. Right. And on the
under the age of 14.
That's right. And on your point about Joe Nye, who trained me, although I tried to deny it along the way for understandable reasons, and Kissinger, yes, they do believe that there are constraints that are on China, but that's why I made the point that everybody is watching how we stick with Ukraine. Because if China comes to the conclusion that at the end of the day, we really are not going to do what President Biden said 3 or 4 times we would do, which is send American troops in to help Taiwan. And if they believe they could do it fast enough that we just couldn't mount the operation even if we wanted to, which is what the cyber operations I was talking about before, then it's a different calculus for them. And the trick for us in the next 10 years is having the integrated deterrence to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's what that meeting last week here between the Japanese Prime Minister and the Philippines President was all about. It's what the AUKUS deal to get nuclear submarines to Australia is all about. It's what the rapprochement between Japan and South Korea is all about. It's about building a network that changes China's risk calculus.
Thank you very much. One more. Is there someone behind the pillar? If there's not, I guess there's not. So we did this perfectly.
Great.
Our host. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Michael.
David. Wonderful.